Hey, so tonight we're going to talk about something that's both fascinating and honestly pretty heartbreaking. The lives of Marie Antoinette's children. I mean, imagine being born into one of the most famous royal families in history, growing up in the most opulent palace in Europe, and then watching as your entire world comes crashing down around you. That's what these kids lived through, and their story is wild. Oh, and if you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. Super curious where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. Always blows my mind how people are falling asleep to this all over the world. All right, find that cozy spot, take a nice slow breath and just let your body sink into whatever you're lying on. We're heading back to 18th century France, and trust me, you're going to be real grateful for that mattress by the time we're done. So congratulations, you just woke up in Versailles Palace, 1778. Your eyes flutter open to a strange, flickering light. It takes you a moment to realize you're not in your bedroom. The ceiling above you is impossibly high, painted with scenes of Greek gods lounging among clouds. The walls around you are covered in silk damask in a pale blue that catches the light from dozens of candles in gilded sconces. You're lying on a feather mattress supported by a wooden frame, but there's no memory foam here, just layers of wool and horsehair beneath the feathers, a bit lumpy in spots. Your sheets are smooth linen washed with lavender water, but they're nothing like the high-thread count sheets you're used to. The heavy brocade canopy above your bed keeps in some warmth, but the room itself is chilly despite a fire crackling in a marble fireplace across the room. The smell hits you next. Interesting mix. Beeswax from the candles, wood smoke from the fire, and something else. Is that body odour? Yeah, even in a palace, daily bathing isn't really a thing yet. There's also a faint whiff of perfume, almost sickeningly sweet, trying to mask the other smells. And from somewhere distant, the smell of baking bread is finding its way to your nostrils. Your ears pick up the sounds of early morning at Versailles. Outside, birds are singing in the immaculate gardens. Inside, there's the soft rustle of silk as servants move about, the distant echo of footsteps on marble floors, someone laughing several rooms away. From beyond your windows, you can hear the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones as early visitors arrive at the palace. Welcome to the most extravagant court in Europe, home to King Louis XVI and his wife, the infamous Marie Antoinette, a place of incredible beauty, cutthroat politics, and extreme wealth, though you wouldn't know it from the chamber pots hidden in ornate cabinets throughout the palace. Yeah, indoor plumbing isn't really a thing yet either. It's into this world that Marie Antoinette's children were born. Actually, scratch that. Let's back up a bit, because if we're going to understand the lives of Marie Antoinette's children, we first need to understand their mother, and her story starts way before the kids came along. Marie Antoinette was born in Vienna, Austria in 1755, November 2nd to be exact. She wasn't just any Austrian girl though, she was an archduchess, the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria and Holy Roman Emperor Francis I. Pretty much from birth, Marie Antoinette was a political pawn. At the age of 14, and I want you to really think about that, she was just 14. She was sent to France to marry the future King Louis XVI as part of a political alliance between Austria and France. Can you imagine being sent to a completely foreign country as a teenager, expected to adapt to their customs, learn their language, and, oh yeah, help produce an heir to secure the alliance? The marriage was rough from the start. Louis was shy, awkward, and not particularly interested in, well, doing what newlyweds typically do. Marie Antoinette remained a virgin for 7 years after their wedding. 7 years. I mean, Picture it. You're a teenage girl, sent to a foreign country, married to a guy who shows zero interest in touching you, while the entire court gossips about your failure to produce an heir. And let me tell you, the rumours were flying. Pre-revolutionary French Twitter, as it were, was absolutely buzzing with speculation about the royal couple's bedroom activities, or lack thereof. This was no small matter. The entire point of Marie being sent to France was to solidify the alliance by producing royal children. Her mother sent her regular letters basically asking, "So, pregnant yet?" The pressure must have been immense. The problem seemed to be with Louis. Some historians think he might have had a physical condition called phimosis, which can make intercourse painful. Others think it was psychological. Whatever the case, it wasn't until Louis's brother-in-law had a heart-to-heart with him about the mechanics of the situation that things finally changed. And so, in December 1778, after 8 long years of marriage, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her first child, a daughter they named Marie-Thérèse Charlotte. Now, let's talk about what royal childbirth was like, because it was nothing like today. When Marie Antoinette went into labour, it was not a private affair. No, the Queen gave birth in front of an audience, and not just a doctor and a couple of nurses. We're talking about up to 200 people crowded into her bedchamber to witness the event. Imagine that for a second. You're in excruciating pain, going through one of the most vulnerable experiences of your life, and there are 200 aristocrats just watching. It was royal protocol. They had to make sure the baby was truly the royal baby and not some substitute smuggled in. The room was hot, stuffy, and crowded. Marie Antoinette actually passed out at one point from the heat and lack of air. The windows were all sealed shut because of a belief that fresh air was dangerous during childbirth. The poor woman was in labour for 12 hours in these conditions. Folks, if you've ever given birth or witnessed someone giving birth, just imagine doing that with 200 people staring at you in a room with no ventilation. When little Marie-Thérèse finally arrived, there was disappointment all around that the baby wasn't a boy. The kingdom needed a male heir, after all. But Marie Antoinette, her first words upon learning she had a daughter were surprisingly sweet. She said, "Poor little girl, you are not what was desired, but you are no less dear to me on that account. A son would have belonged to the state. You shall be mine." And she meant it. By all accounts, Marie Antoinette was a devoted mother who adored her children. She broke with royal tradition by being actively involved in her children's upbringing, which was unusual for queens at the time. That said, royal protocol still severely restricted how much time she could spend with her children. The royal children had their own household staff, including a governess, wet nurses, and various attendants. The first governess was Princesse de Guémené, who was later replaced by one of Marie Antoinette's closest friends, the Duchess of Polignac. Daily life for little Marie-Thérèse was a strange mix of opulence and restriction. Her rooms were beautifully decorated, she had gorgeous clothes and toys, and she was surrounded by servants catering to her every need. But she was also bound by the strict etiquette of the French court from an early age. A typical day for the young princess would start with dressing, and even that was a ceremonial affair. Her clothes would be presented to her mother from a book of fabric swatches each morning. The queen would choose what her daughter would wear, and then several ladies in waiting would help dress the child. There was a proper way to do everything at Versailles, even for children. After dressing came breakfast, typically simple by our standards, maybe some bread with butter or jam and hot chocolate, which was a favourite at the French court. Then would come lessons, French grammar and literature, history, a bit of geography, music, dancing, and of course, proper court etiquette. The young princess would also be taught needlework and other feminine accomplishments deemed appropriate for a royal daughter. All of this would be overseen by her governess and various tutors. Marie-Thérèse didn't have other children to play with, aside from her siblings, when they eventually came along. She lived in a world of adults, all of whom treated her with the deference due a princess of France, but few of whom showed her genuine warmth. Life improved somewhat for the young princess in 1781, when Marie Antoinette finally gave birth to a son, Louis Joseph, the long-awaited Dauphin of France. The court rejoiced at the birth of a male heir, and Marie Antoinette's position became more secure. Louis Joseph was a bright child, but frail. From birth, he seemed sickly, though everyone tried to ignore this fact. He was, after all, the future of the monarchy. After Louis Joseph's birth, Marie Antoinette became increasingly frustrated with the constraints of court life. She wanted to spend more time with her children, away from the prying eyes and gossip of courtiers. This desire led her to retreat more and more to the Petit Trianon, a small chateau on the grounds of Versailles that had been given to her as a gift by Louis XVI. The Petit Trianon became Marie Antoinette's sanctuary. There she could escape the rigid etiquette of court and spend time with her children in a more relaxed atmosphere. She could dress in simpler clothes, though still luxurious by any normal standard, and indulge in activities that weren't possible in the main palace. One of these activities was her famous play acting at being a shepherdess or milkmaid at her hamlet, a rustic village built on the grounds nearby. This little fantasy village had real farm animals and working dairy, though servants did all the actual work. Marie Antoinette and her children would pretend to live a simple country life there, milking cows that had been carefully cleaned beforehand and gathering eggs that had been strategically placed for them to find. It sounds ridiculous, and it kind of was, but it was also Marie Antoinette's attempt to create some semblance of a normal life for herself and her children. The problem was, this retreat from court life only fueled rumours about what she might be doing away from public view. The French people were already struggling with food shortages and economic problems, and stories of the Queen playing shepherdess while real peasants starved didn't exactly help her reputation, though to be fair, she never actually said, "let them eat cake." That's a myth attributed to her much later. In 1785, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her second son, Louis Charles. Unlike his older brother, Louis Charles was robust and healthy, with rosy cheeks and boundless energy. Marie Antoinette doted on all her children, but there are indications that Louis Charles might have been her favourite. Now, this is where the gossip gets real nasty. There were rumours that Louis Charles wasn't actually the king's son, but rather the child of Marie Antoinette's supposed lover, a Swedish diplomat named Axel von Fersen. Most historians today believe Louis Charles was indeed Louis XV's child. But the rumours persisted and damaged Marie Antoinette's reputation further. The following year, 1786, Marie Antoinette gave birth to her fourth and final child, a daughter named Sophie Beatrix. Sadly, little Sophie was born prematurely and lived just 11 months before dying in 1787. Her death was the first tragedy to strike the royal children, but unfortunately it wouldn't be the last. Marie Antoinette was devastated by Sophie's death when someone tried to comfort her by suggesting that Sophie was too young to have formed a strong attachment to her mother. Marie Antoinette replied, "Don't forget that she would have been my friend." The Queen had little time to mourn, however, as political storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. France was in serious financial trouble, partly due to its support of the American Revolution against Britain. The country was deeply in debt, and the common people were suffering from poor harvests, high bread prices, and crushing taxes. Meanwhile, at Versailles, life continued in its bubble of luxury and ceremony. The royal children, sheltered from the harsh realities of the world outside the palace gates, continued their lessons and play. Marie-Thérèse was now approaching adolescence. Louis-Joseph was showing signs of the intelligence that made everyone hopeful for his future reign despite his health issues. And little Louis Charles was the picture of childish exuberance. None of them had any idea that their privileged world was about to come crashing down around them. In the summer of 1789, two devastating blows struck the royal family in quick succession. First, in June, 7-year-old Louis-Joseph, the Dauphin and heir to the throne, died after a long illness. Historians believe he probably had tuberculosis of the spine, which would eventually cause his spine to collapse. Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were heartbroken at the loss of their son, but they had little time to grieve before the second blow fell. Just weeks after Louis Joseph's death, on July 14, 1789, the people of Paris stormed the Bastille prison, marking the beginning of the French Revolution. The death of Louis Joseph meant that 4-year-old Louis Charles was now the Dauphin, the new heir to the throne. But it was a precarious inheritance, as the monarchy itself was beginning to crumble. As you settle deeper into your bed, feeling the weight of your covers and the softness beneath you, we'll continue exploring what happened to Marie Antoinette's children when their world was turned upside down by revolution. Your breathing slows naturally as you watch the royal family's privileged life at Versailles give way to one of the most turbulent periods in European history. The storming of the Bastille in July 1789 sent shockwaves through Versailles. The royal family, still mourning the death of Louis Joseph, suddenly faced a threat they couldn't fully comprehend. For Marie Antoinette's surviving children, 10-year-old Marie-Thérèse and 4-year-old Louis Charles, their protected world was about to shatter. At first, life at Versailles continued almost normally for the children. They were shielded from understanding the full gravity of what was happening in Paris, just 18 miles away. Their lessons went on, their routines remained the same, but their mother was increasingly anxious, and the atmosphere in the palace grew tense. Then came October 5th, 1789, a day that would change everything. Thousands of Parisian women, driven by hunger and anger over bread shortages, marched from Paris to Versailles in what became known as the Women's March on Versailles. The crowd arrived at the palace gates, soaking wet from the pouring rain, their clothes muddy and bedraggled, their faces gaunt with hunger. Imagine the stark contrast. Outside the gilded gates, thousands of starving women who had walked for hours in the rain, demanding bread for their children. Inside, chandeliers, silk-covered walls, and a royal family who had never known hunger. The situation escalated quickly. The crowd broke into the palace, killing several guards. One guard ran to Marie Antoinette's bedchamber to warn her, blood streaming from his wounds. The queen fled in her nightgown, running barefoot through the palace corridors to the king's apartments. Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles were rushed there too, terrified by the commotion. For hours, the royal family huddled together as negotiations took place. Finally, the king agreed to return with the crowd to Paris. The revolutionaries wanted the royal family where they could see them, not hidden away at Versailles. That same day, the royal family was forced to leave Versailles. They never returned. Can you imagine? For Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles, Versailles was the only home they'd ever known. Now they were being taken away, surrounded by a hostile crowd, many of whom were calling for their mother's head. The children likely didn't understand why these people hated their family so much. How could they? The royal family was installed in the Tuileries Palace in Paris, which had been mostly unused for years. It was dusty, neglected, and nowhere near as comfortable as Versailles. They were effectively under house arrest, though at this stage they were still treated with the outward respect due royalty. The king still held his title, and there was hope that a constitutional monarchy might be established. Daily life for Marie-Thérèse and Louis-Charles changed dramatically. The luxury of Versailles was gone, replaced by the more austere surroundings of the Tuileries. Their freedom of movement was restricted. The sounds of the bustling city replaced the peaceful gardens of Versailles. The smell of the Seine River, not particularly pleasant in those days, wafted through the palace windows along with the various odours of a crowded city. Still, Marie Antoinette tried to maintain some normalcy for her children. Lessons continued. Louis-Charles played with his toy soldiers and building blocks. Marie-Thérèse practiced her music and needlework, but there was no escaping the sense that they were now prisoners rather than royalty. As the revolution progressed, the situation grew more precarious. The royal family's mail was opened and read. Their movements were closely monitored. The king's powers were increasingly restricted by the new National Assembly. Anti-royalist newspapers published vicious attacks on Marie Antoinette, giving her cruel nicknames like Madame Deficit and the Austrian she-wolf. Marie Antoinette, who had once been frivolous and extravagant, changed during this period. Witnesses described how her hair turned white from stress. She became focused solely on protecting her children and finding a way out of their increasingly dangerous situation. In June 1791, after almost 2 years of this tense captivity, the royal family made a desperate attempt to escape France. It was a risky plan that had been in the works for months, coordinated with loyalists and Marie Antoinette's supposed lover, Count Axel von Fersen. On the night of June 20th, the family disguised themselves as servants of a fictional Baroness de Korff, actually their children's governess. Marie Antoinette wore a plain grey dress and a black hat that hid most of her face. The king donned a simple brown coat and a wig. Marie-Thérèse, now 12, was dressed as the Baroness's daughter, while 6-year-old Louis Charles was disguised as a girl to match the passport they were using. They slipped out of the Tuileries through unguarded passages and climbed into a large custom-built carriage that waited nearby. Their destination was Montmédy, a royalist stronghold near the border with the Austrian Netherlands, where Marie Antoinette's brother reigned as emperor. The escape might have worked if not for a series of delays and mishaps. The bulky carriage moved slower than planned. The king insisted on stops that weren't in the schedule. Most fatally, Louis XVI was recognised by a postmaster named Jean-Baptiste Drouet in the town of Varennes, about 30 miles from their destination. Drouet had seen the king's portrait on a coin and noticed the resemblance to this supposed valet. He alerted local officials and the family was detained, then sent back to Paris under guard. This failed escape attempt was a disaster for the royal family. Before, there had been some sympathy for them, especially for the children. Now they were viewed as traitors trying to flee the country to potentially organise a counter-revolution with foreign help. The tenuous trust between the monarchy and the revolutionaries was shattered. Upon their return to Paris, the family's confinement became much stricter. Guards were posted in their private apartments. They were watched day and night with no privacy even for basic bodily functions. The revolution was radicalizing and the monarchy's days were numbered. Things came to a head on August 10th, 1792, when revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace. The royal family fled to the nearby Legislative Assembly for protection. For 33 hours, they were kept in a reporter's box at the Assembly, listening as the monarchy was officially suspended and plans were made for the king's trial. Then, on August 13th, 1792, the royal family was transferred to the Temple, a medieval fortress in Paris that would serve as their prison. This was no palace. The temple was dark, damp and forbidding, with thick stone walls and small windows that let in little light. The temple consisted of a large tower and a small tower connected by buildings. The royal family was initially housed in the small tower while the large tower was being prepared for them. They were given just a few rooms to share. Their possessions from the Tuileries were brought to them, but many items were stolen or damaged in transit. The first months at the temple were difficult but not yet unbearable. The family was kept together. They established a routine. The king gave lessons to Louis Charles in geography and history. Marie Antoinette and Marie Thérèse did needlework. They read books from a small library that was allowed to them. They took walks in the temple garden under heavy guard. But as autumn turned to winter, conditions worsened. The guards became more hostile, often mocking the family or smoking pipes to fill the rooms with unpleasant smoke. The family was given fewer comforts, and most significantly, in December 1792, the king was separated from his family to stand trial for treason. The separation was heart-wrenching. Louis Charles, now 7, clung to his father, begging him not to go. Marie Thérèse and Marie Antoinette wept. The king promised to see them the next morning, but this would not be allowed. Louis XV's trial was swift and the outcome predetermined. He was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. On January 20th, 1793, the day before his execution, he was allowed one final visit with his family. This last meeting was agonizing. The king held his son on his lap, making Louis Charles promise to forgive the people who had caused his parents suffering. He gave his blessing to Marie Thérèse and asked her to take care of her mother and brother. Then he embraced Marie Antoinette one last time. When it was time to leave, Louis Charles threw himself into his father's arms, screaming and begging to die with him. The king, maintaining his composure until this point, finally broke down. He tore himself away and retreated to his cell, unable to bear a more prolonged goodbye. The next morning, January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine at the Place de la Révolution, now the Place de la Concorde. His last words, cut off by the drums ordered to drown out his voice, were, "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France." Back at the temple, Marie Antoinette refused to tell Louis Charles that his father was dead. Perhaps she couldn't bear to break his heart, or perhaps she was trying to protect him from the horrible truth, but the boy must have sensed something was terribly wrong. His father never returned, and his mother wore black and wept constantly. The family's treatment worsened after the king's death. Marie Antoinette was now referred to only as the Widow Capet, using the ancestral name of the royal dynasty rather than her royal title. Their guards became crueler, often waking them at night for head counts or inspections. Marie Antoinette, Marie Thérèse, and Louis Charles were moved to the main tower of the temple, which had been renovated to serve as a more secure prison. The tower was cold and drafty, with little comfort. The windows were covered with iron bars and screens that limited their view of the outside world and reduced the natural light. Despite these hardships, Marie Antoinette did her best to maintain a routine for her children. She continued to give Louis Charles lessons, though she had few materials to work with. She and Marie Thérèse sewed and mended their increasingly shabby clothes. In the evenings, they would play simple games or read from the few books they were allowed. But the revolutionary government wasn't done separating the family. They had a particular interest in young Louis Charles, who royalists now considered to be King Louis XVII following his father's execution. As the legitimate heir to the throne, he was both a symbol and a potential rallying point for counter-revolutionaries. On July 3, 1793, officials arrived at the temple with orders to take Louis Charles away from his mother. Marie Antoinette was horrified. She placed herself in front of her son, refusing to let the officials take him. For over an hour, she physically resisted, holding the terrified boy in her arms as he clung to her. Finally, the officials threatened to kill both Marie-Thérèse and Marie Antoinette if she did not comply. Only then did she reluctantly release her son. Louis Charles, just 8 years old, was screaming and crying as he was dragged away. He would never see his mother again. The little boy was taken to another section of the temple tower and placed in the care of Antoine Simon, a cobbler and harsh revolutionary. Simon's job was to re-educate the former prince and turn him into a good republican citizen. The methods he used were nothing short of abuse. Louis Charles, who had been raised with every luxury and treated with deference his entire life, was now subjected to constant verbal abuse. Simon forced him to wear a red liberty cap, the symbol of the revolution. He was taught revolutionary songs and made to denounce his parents and the monarchy. When he resisted, he was beaten. Most horrifically, Simon and his wife got the child drunk on wine and taught him obscene language, delighting in hearing the former prince curse. They neglected his hygiene and health, leaving him in filthy clothes and feeding him poor quality food. Meanwhile, Marie Antoinette was devastated by the loss of her son. She would spend hours near a small crack in the wall of her chamber, hoping to catch a glimpse of Louis Charles when he was taken to the garden for air. She could sometimes hear him singing revolutionary songs in a slurred, drunken voice, which must have been heart-wrenching. On August 2, 1793, Marie Antoinette was awakened in the middle of the night and told to prepare to leave. She was being transferred to the Conciergerie prison to await her own trial. She was allowed only the briefest goodbye to Marie-Thérèse, who was now left alone with her aunt Louis XVI's Mississippi Elizabeth. Marie-Thérèse, now 14, was old enough to understand what was happening but powerless to stop it. In her later memoirs, she described hearing her brother crying when his jailers beat him, though she was never allowed to see him. The siblings were kept on different floors of the same building, close enough to hear each other but prevented from any contact. After Marie Antoinette was taken away, Marie-Thérèse asked repeatedly about her mother, but the guards refused to give her any information. She wasn't told of her mother's execution on October 16, 1793. Instead, she was left to wonder and worry, with only her Aunt Elizabeth for comfort. Then, in May 1794, Elizabeth was also taken away and executed. Marie-Thérèse was now completely alone, the sole remaining member of her immediate family in the Temple Tower. She wasn't told about her aunt's fate either. She simply found herself suddenly, terrifyingly isolated. For the 15-year-old princess, the following months were a nightmare of uncertainty and loneliness. She had no news of her family, no company except hostile guards, and no idea what her own fate would be. She was allowed only 2 books, which she read over and over again. Her only other activities were sewing and knitting with materials the guards reluctantly provided. Her treatment, while not as physically abusive as her brother's, was still harsh. She was given poor food, few changes of clothing, and almost no comforts. The guards rarely spoke to her except to give orders. She later wrote that the lack of human contact was one of the most difficult aspects of her imprisonment. As for Louis Charles, his situation deteriorated further after Simon departed in January 1794. Rather than assigning a new guardian, the Committee of Public Safety decided to keep the boy in solitary confinement. His room was locked from the outside, and food was passed through a small wicket in the door. The 8-year-old boy was now completely alone in a dark, cold room. No one cleaned his chamber or changed his clothes or bedding. No one spoke to him except to deliver food. He had no toys, no books, no activities, nothing to occupy his mind. He spent his days in near total isolation, with only occasional checks by guards who rarely even entered his room. Under these conditions, Louis Charles's physical and mental health rapidly declined. He stopped speaking. He stopped cleaning himself. He barely ate. When officials occasionally inspected his cell, they found him sitting in filth, his bed crawling with bugs, his body covered in sores. In the spring of 1795, nearly a year and a half after this solitary confinement began, a new government came to power following the fall of Robespierre and the end of the Reign of Terror. This government, the Directory, was less radical than its predecessor. They sent a doctor, Philippe Jean Pelletan, to examine Louis Charles. Dr. Pelletan was shocked by what he found. The once handsome, lively prince was now unrecognizable. At 10 years old, he was the size of a 5 or 6-year-old, his body stunted by malnutrition. His face and body were covered in sores and scars. He had swollen joints and a distended belly, classic signs of severe malnutrition. Most disturbing of all, he barely reacted to the doctor's presence, showing signs of profound psychological trauma. Despite Dr. Pelletan's efforts to improve his care, it was too late. On June 8, 1795, Louis Charles died, likely of tuberculosis worsened by malnutrition and neglect. He was just 10 years old. You shift a bit in your bed now, finding a more comfortable position. Your shoulders drop just a little, releasing tension you didn't know you were holding as you settle in deeper. The weight of your blanket feels comforting as we continue with what happened to Marie-Thérèse, the only surviving child of Marie Antoinette, who remained alone in her prison cell, unaware that she was now the sole remaining member of her immediate family. Marie-Thérèse remained alone in her cell at the Temple Tower, unaware of her brother's fate. Just 16 years old, she had no idea that she was now the only survivor of her immediate family. The guards kept all news from her, leaving her in a cruel limbo of uncertainty and hope. The summer of 1795 passed slowly for the teenage princess. Each day blended into the next in a monotonous rhythm of isolation. She would wake on her simple bed, the straw mattress rustling beneath her as she moved. The summer heat made her small room stifling, with only a narrow window letting in meagre light and little fresh air. The stone walls around her held the heat like an oven. Her once fine clothes were now worn and shabby, the fabric thin from repeated washings. Her hair, which had once been styled elaborately by ladies in waiting, she now had to manage herself with no mirror and few combs. The sounds of her imprisonment became a familiar backdrop to her days. The heavy tread of guards' boots in the corridor outside, the jangle of keys, the distant shouts from the street beyond the fortress walls, the bells of Paris churches marking the hours, reminding her of a world going on without her. Her meals were simple and often unappetizing. Plain bread, thin soup, occasionally a bit of meat or cheese, a far cry from the elaborate feasts she had known at Versailles, where 20 or more dishes might be served at a single meal. She ate alone, using simple utensils, nothing like the gold or silver service of her former life. To pass the time, Marie-Thérèse read her 2 books over and over, devotional texts that provided her some comfort. She sewed and knitted, mending her clothes with the limited materials she was given. She wrote in a journal when paper was available, documenting her thoughts and memories to maintain her sanity in the crushing solitude. Sometimes she would stand on tiptoe at her window, trying to glimpse the sky or the street below. She could hear the voices of people going about their lives, vendors calling their wares, children playing. It must have been both comforting and painful, evidence that normal life continued somewhere beyond her walls. At night, she would lie on her bed, listening to the sounds of the old tower settling around her. The summer months brought thunderstorms that illuminated her room in brief flashes, followed by the low rumble that shook the ancient stones. During those storms, alone in the darkness, did she imagine her family somewhere out there, still alive? Did she hope for rescue, or had she begun to accept her isolation as permanent? While Marie-Thérèse endured her solitary confinement, political changes were reshaping France. The Reign of Terror had ended with the fall of Robespierre in July 1794. The new government, the Directory, was more moderate than its predecessors. As the revolutionary fervour cooled, attitudes towards the remaining royal family member began to shift. François, who, a former servant of the royal family, had been quietly advocating for Marie-Thérèse's release. He found an ally in Paul Barras, a powerful member of the Directory. Barras had visited the temple and been disturbed by the conditions in which the young princess was kept. In another part of Europe, Marie-Thérèse's relatives were also working for her release. Her mother's family, the Austrian Habsburgs, had been negotiating with the French government. Her uncle, Emperor Francis II, wanted his niece sent to Vienna. The negotiations were complex, involving the exchange of French prisoners held by Austria. Finally, in December 1795, after 3 years and 4 months of imprisonment, the order came for Marie-Thérèse's release. When officials arrived to tell her she was free, she initially didn't believe them. Why would she? After years of deception and cruelty, trust didn't come easily. "Where am I going?" she asked. "To your family," was the reply. "I have no family," she said quietly. It was only then, as preparations were made for her departure, that Marie-Thérèse was finally told the fates of her mother, father, aunt, and brother. The news was delivered bluntly, without compassion for the traumatized teenager. Imagine learning all at once that everyone you loved had died while you sat in isolation, hoping for reunion. Marie-Thérèse didn't cry. Years of imprisonment had taught her to hide her emotions, but those who saw her described a look of such profound shock and grief that it was more affecting than tears. On December 18th, 1795, the day before her 17th birthday, Marie-Thérèse left the Temple prison. She emerged into a winter evening, seeing the stars for the first time in years. The cold air must have felt sharp in her lungs after so long in the stale confines of her cell. She was taken to a house where she was properly bathed, perhaps for the first time in years, and given new clothes befitting her status. The sensation of clean, fresh fabric against her skin, of warm water washing away the physical reminders of her imprisonment. These small comforts must have seemed almost overwhelming after such prolonged deprivation. But there was no time for her to adjust. Political considerations demanded she leave France quickly. On December 26th, she was taken to Basel, Switzerland, where she was exchanged for French prisoners in a formal ceremony at the border. As she crossed into foreign territory, she left behind the land of her birth, the country where her family had ruled for centuries, and where they had all met their deaths. Marie-Thérèse was now truly alone, a displaced princess with no kingdom. She had been raised to be a French royal, educated in French history and culture. Now she found herself in exile, her identity stripped away along with everything and everyone she had known. From Switzerland, Marie-Thérèse travelled to Vienna, the birthplace of her mother. She arrived at the Hofburg Palace, where her grandmother Empress Maria Theresa had once ruled, and where her mother had spent her childhood before being sent to France as a 14-year-old bride. The contrast between the Temple prison and the Habsburg Imperial Palace must have been jarring. After years in a sparse cell, she now found herself surrounded by opulence again. Gilded ceilings, crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and soft beds with fine linens. Servants attended to her needs. She had access to baths, clean clothes, and proper meals. But the psychological transition was not so easy. Marie-Thérèse was described as serious and withdrawn. She spoke little and smiled rarely. She suffered from nightmares and was sometimes heard crying out in her sleep. The trauma of her experiences had left deep scars that no amount of luxury could heal. Her uncle, Emperor Francis II, treated her kindly, but also saw her as a political asset. The Habsburg-Bourbon connection could still have value in the complex chess game of European politics. Marie-Thérèse was a living symbol of the old order that revolutionary France had sought to destroy. In Vienna, Marie-Thérèse was reunited with people who had known her mother. Ladies who had served in Marie Antoinette's childhood household came to pay their respects to the daughter who so resembled her. They brought stories and memories, helping Marie-Thérèse connect with the mother she had lost. She also met relatives she had never known, Habsburg cousins who shared her blood but not her experiences. They treated her with a mixture of fascination and pity, this cousin who had endured what none of them could imagine. Marie-Thérèse spent 3 years in Vienna, gradually adjusting to freedom and learning to live with her grief. She dedicated herself to honouring her family's memory, collecting and preserving items associated with them when possible. She wore a ring containing a small piece of her mother's hair, a tangible connection to the parent she had lost. During this time, her father's brothers, the Counts of Provence and Artois, who had fled France before the worst of the revolution, were living in exile, still claiming the French throne. The Count of Provence had declared himself King Louis XVI after the death of Marie-Thérèse's brother, who royalists considered to have been King Louis XVII. Louis XVI wanted Marie-Thérèse to join him and strengthen his claim to the throne. He also had a particular marriage in mind for her, to her cousin Louis-Antoine, Duke of Angoulême, who was the son of the Count of Artois. This marriage would unite different branches of the Bourbon family and create a stronger royalist position. Marie-Thérèse was not enthusiastic about the marriage. She had little in common with her cousin, who was described as dull and unimaginative, but she had been raised to do her duty, and after the horrors she had survived, perhaps such a mundane concern as marital compatibility seemed trivial. In 1799, at the age of 20, Marie-Thérèse left Vienna and travelled to Mitau, now Jelgava in Latvia, where her uncle Louis XVI had established a small court in exile. There she married Louis-Antoine in a simple ceremony, becoming the Duchess of Angoulême. The marriage was not a love match, and by all accounts it was never consummated. Some historians suggest that Marie-Thérèse's traumatic experiences had left her unable to bear physical intimacy. Others believe that Louis-Antoine may have had his own issues. Whatever the reason, the couple remained childless, ending the direct line from Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. Despite the personal limitations of her marriage, Marie-Thérèse was devoted to the royalist cause. She became an important figure in the émigré community, a living link to the pre-revolutionary monarchy. Her dignified bearing and obvious suffering made her a powerful symbol for those who hoped to restore the Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The émigrés lived a precarious existence, moving from country to country as political winds shifted. From Metau, they were forced to flee to England when Tsar Paul I of Russia withdrew his support. In England, they lived modestly, supported by the British government and royalist sympathisers. Throughout these years of exile, Marie-Thérèse was haunted by impostors claiming to be her brother Louis Charles. Over 100 different men came forward over time, claiming to be the lost Dauphin who had somehow escaped the Temple prison. The most persistent of these pretenders was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a German clockmaker who maintained until his death that he was Louis XVII. He wrote to Marie-Thérèse, begging her to acknowledge him as her brother. These letters must have been deeply disturbing to her, reopening wounds that had never fully healed. Marie-Thérèse consistently refused to meet with any of these claimants. She knew the truth. She had heard her brother's cries through the walls of the temple. She knew he had died there, alone and suffering. But the uncertainty surrounding Louis Charles's death and burial gave these impostors just enough credibility to gain followers and attention. The question of her brother's fate would continue to trouble Marie-Thérèse for the rest of her life. It wasn't until 2000, long after her death, that DNA testing confirmed once and for all that Louis Charles had indeed died in the Temple prison, as history had recorded. The testing was performed on a preserved heart that had been smuggled out by the doctor who performed the autopsy in 1795. Meanwhile, the political situation in France continued to evolve. The Directory gave way to the Consulate under Napoleon Bonaparte, which in turn became the French Empire when Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804. The Bourbon claim to the throne seemed increasingly remote as Napoleon's power grew. Marie-Thérèse watched from exile as the man she considered a usurper ruled the country that had once been her family's domain. Napoleon's wife, Empress Josephine, even wore jewellery that had once belonged to Marie Antoinette, jewellery that had been looted during the Revolution. A personal affront to the daughter who treasured every memento of her mother. But Napoleon's empire was not destined to last. His military ambitions eventually led to his downfall, and in 1814, following Napoleon's first abdication, Louis XVIII was restored to the French throne. After 22 years in exile, Marie-Thérèse returned to France as part of the royal family. Her return to Paris must have been emotionally complex. The city held so many painful memories. The Tuileries Palace where they had been held under house arrest, the Temple prison where she had lost her family, the Place de la Révolution where her parents had been executed. Many of the same people who had cheered her parents' deaths now lined the streets to welcome the returning royalty. Marie-Thérèse was now 35 years old. The pretty, innocent princess who had left Versailles during the Revolution was now a solemn, prematurely aged woman, often described as looking older than her years. The trauma of her experiences had left its mark not just on her mind but on her appearance. At the restored Bourbon court, Marie-Thérèse played an important role as the king's niece. She was known for her charity work and her devotion to the memory of her parents. She worked to locate the burial sites of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, whose bodies had been hastily interred in unmarked graves after their executions. In January 1815, Marie-Thérèse attended a solemn ceremony at the Church of Saint-Denis, where the remains of her parents were reinterred with proper honour. For the first time, she was able to mourn them publicly and see them laid to rest with the dignity befitting a king and queen of France. But the Bourbon Restoration was fragile. In March 1815, Napoleon escaped from his exile on Elba and returned to France, beginning the period known as the 100 Days. Louis XVIII and the court were forced to flee Paris once again, a bitter reminder to Marie-Thérèse of her childhood flight from Versailles. During this crisis, Marie-Thérèse showed remarkable courage. While the king and her husband fled, she remained in Bordeaux, rallying troops to the royalist cause. Her bravery impressed even Napoleon, who reportedly said she was the only man in her family. Though her efforts ultimately failed and she too had to flee when Napoleon's forces approached, her actions earned her new respect among the French people. After Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo and his permanent exile to St. Helena, the Bourbons returned to power once more. Louis XIV ruled until his death in 1824, when he was succeeded by Marie-Thérèse's father-in-law, who became King Charles VI. Charles VI was far more conservative than his brother had been, seeking to restore the absolute monarchy of the pre-revolutionary era. His policies were increasingly unpopular, creating tensions that would eventually lead to another revolution. During these years, Marie-Thérèse continued her charitable work and maintained a dignified presence at court. She was particularly dedicated to helping the orphans of soldiers who had died in service to France, perhaps seeing in them a reflection of her own childhood loss. Taking a slow, deep breath, you sink a little deeper into your mattress, your muscles relaxing as you listen. Your eyes feel heavy, but in a good way, as you follow Marie-Thérèse's journey from prisoner to royal duchess. The weight of your blanket feels comforting as we continue exploring what happened when another revolution shook France and once again changed the course of Marie-Thérèse's already tumultuous life. In July 1830, the fragile peace of the Bourbon Restoration shattered. The people of Paris once again took to the streets in revolution, this time against the increasingly unpopular Charles V. Marie-Thérèse found herself reliving the nightmare of her childhood as angry crowds surrounded the royal palace. This revolution, known as the July Revolution, unfolded much faster than the one that had destroyed her family. Within just 3 days, Charles VI realised his position was untenable. He decided to abdicate in favour of his young grandson, Henri, Duke of Bordeaux, hoping this might save the monarchy. On August 2nd, 1830, Charles VI signed his abdication. According to protocol, this made his son, Louis-Antoine, Marie-Thérèse's husband, the new king. Louis-Antoine initially refused to sign away his rights, but faced with the reality of the situation and pressure from his father, he eventually agreed. There's a strange footnote to history here. Technically, for the approximately 20 minutes between Charles VI's abdication and Louis-Antoine's renunciation of his rights, Marie-Thérèse was Queen of France. The little girl who had lost everything to revolution had, for a brief moment, attained the position her mother had held. But this was a hollow crown. The revolutionaries had no intention of accepting another Bourbon king, regardless of who it was. Instead, they offered the throne to Louis-Philippe, Duke of Orleans, from a different branch of the royal family. Louis-Philippe accepted, becoming not the King of France, but the King of the French, a constitutional monarch rather than an absolute one. For the second time in her life, Marie-Thérèse was forced into exile. The royal family retreated first to England, then settled in Prague in what is now the Czech Republic. Charles the King died in 1836 and Louis-Antoine in 1844, leaving Marie-Thérèse a widow. She adopted the title of Countess of Marness and lived quietly, dedicated to charitable works and her religious faith. In her later years, Marie-Thérèse was described as solemn and dignified, with occasional flashes of the haughtiness that had characterized her mother. Her hair had turned completely white by the time she was in her 40s. Visitors often remarked on her strong resemblance to Marie Antoinette, though without her mother's famous beauty or charm. The trauma and grief of her life had etched themselves onto her features. Despite her personal tragedies, Marie-Thérèse maintained a remarkable strength of character. She never complained about her fate, though she spoke often of her family and worked tirelessly to preserve their memory. She collected what mementos she could, letters, portraits, personal items, creating a private shrine to the parents and siblings she had lost. Her relationship with the young Henri, Duke of Bordeaux, later known as the Count of Chambord, was particularly important to her. As the grandson of Charles VI, he was now the legitimate claimant to the French throne. Marie-Thérèse became a mother figure to him, guiding his education and instilling in him the values of the Bourbon dynasty. Perhaps in this role she found some consolation for her own childlessness and the loss of her brother. In 1851, Marie-Thérèse was living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire when she contracted pneumonia. She died on October 19, 1851, at the castle of Frosdorf near Vienna. She was 72 years old, the same age her mother would have been had she lived. Marie-Thérèse was buried in the crypt of the Franciscan monastery in Nova Gorica, in what is now Slovenia, alongside other members of the exiled Bourbon family. Her tombstone bears the simple inscription, Fille de Louis XVI et de Marie Antoinette, daughter of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. After all her titles and tribulations, this was the identity that defined her. With Marie-Thérèse's death, the direct line of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette came to an end. The little girl who had woken to the sounds of an angry mob at Versailles, who had heard her brother's cries through the prison walls, who had emerged from captivity to learn her entire family was dead, had finally found peace. But what about her brother, Louis Charles? What really happened to the boy who died alone in that tower room? For centuries, the fate of Louis Charles, the lost Dauphin, remained one of history's persistent mysteries. The secrecy surrounding his death and burial, combined with the turbulent times, created the perfect conditions for doubt and conspiracy theories. The official record states that Louis Charles died of tuberculosis in the Temple prison on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. Dr. Pelletan performed an autopsy, during which he secretly removed the boy's heart, hiding it in his handkerchief. His intention was to preserve this royal relic until it could be properly honoured. But the story of the heart is almost as strange as the tales of the supposed survivors. Dr. Pelletan kept the heart in a crystal vase filled with alcohol in his library. During the political upheavals that followed, he feared being discovered with this royalist relic and gave it to a trusted friend for safekeeping. Over the decades, the heart changed hands several times. At one point, it was allegedly stolen by Dr. Pelletan's son's housekeeper, who threw it away thinking it was a piece of old meat. The son found it in the trash and rescued it. Later, the heart was presented to the restored Bourbon monarchy, but was not officially recognized or interred with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. During the 1830 revolution, the heart was trampled underfoot when a mob invaded the Archbishop's palace where it was being kept. Once again, it was rescued and preserved by those loyal to the royal family. For nearly 2 centuries, this small, desiccated organ, no larger than a walnut after years of preservation, was passed from keeper to keeper, a macabre reminder of a child's suffering. Meanwhile, the pretenders continued to appear. Between 1816 and 1850, over 100 different men claimed to be the escaped Louis XVII. Some were obvious frauds, barely bothering to learn French or basic facts about the royal family. Others were more convincing, with elaborate stories of secret rescues and years in hiding. The most persistent of these claimants was Karl Wilhelm Naundorf, a German clockmaker who appeared in Berlin in 1810 with a remarkable claim. According to Naundorf, he had been smuggled out of the temple in a laundry basket, while a sick child was substituted in his place. This substitute, he claimed, was the boy who died in 1795. Naundorf knew an impressive amount about Versailles and the royal family, though historians later showed that much of this information was available in published memoirs. He wrote repeatedly to Marie-Thérèse, begging her to acknowledge him as her brother, but she refused to meet him or respond to his letters. Despite Marie-Thérèse's rejection, Naundorf gathered a following of believers. After his death in 1845, his tombstone in Delft, Netherlands, was inscribed Louis XVII, King of France and Navarre. His descendants continued to use the surname de Bourbon and to press their claim to the French throne well into the 20th century. Another notable pretender was Jean-Marie Hervagault, the son of a tailor, who claimed to have been rescued by royalists who substituted a deaf-mute child in his place. Hervagault was arrested multiple times for fraud, but maintained his story until his death in prison in 1812. Then there was Eleazar Williams, a missionary to Native Americans in the United States, who claimed in the 1840s that he had been brought to America as a child and only learned of his royal identity years later. Williams had a facial scar that he said came from being beaten in the Temple prison, and he allegedly suffered from traumatic amnesia that had erased his early memories. The persistence of these claims speaks to the power of the lost Dauphin's story, the idea that the innocent boy might have escaped his tormentors, that he might have survived to live a full life somewhere beyond France, held a romantic appeal that facts could not easily dispel. It wasn't until 2000 that modern science finally put the mystery to rest. DNA testing was performed on the preserved heart, comparing it with DNA from Marie Antoinette's hair and from living descendants of the Habsburg family. The results confirmed that the heart indeed belonged to a child of Marie Antoinette. Louis Charles had died in that prison cell, just as history recorded. In 2004, the heart was finally interred in the Saint-Denis Basilica, with Louis Charles's parents and other French royalty bringing a measure of closure to one of history's most poignant tragedies. The story of Marie Antoinette's children, Marie-Thérèse, Louis-Joseph, Louis Charles and Sophie, is ultimately a story about the human cost of political upheaval. These children, born to immense privilege but caught in events beyond their control, serve as a reminder of the innocent victims that every revolution creates. Louis-Joseph, the first Dauphin, at least was spared the worst. He died of natural causes before the revolution turned violent, mourned by parents who still had the freedom and resources to grieve properly. His short life was one of comfort and love, unmarred by the horrors that would befall his siblings. Little Sophie, too, was spared the revolution, dying in infancy before the fall of the monarchy. Though her death was a tragedy for her parents, particularly Marie Antoinette, she at least lived and died in the secure world of Versailles, knowing only the comfort and attention that befitted a princess of France. Louis Charles bore perhaps the heaviest burden, separated from his family at 8 years old, subjected to psychological and physical abuse, forced to denounce his own mother, and finally left to waste away in solitary confinement. His short life was marked by a cruelty that's difficult to comprehend. That final image of him, small, sick, and alone in a dark room, stands as one of history's most heartbreaking. Only Marie-Thérèse survived to adulthood, carrying with her the memories of what had been and what was lost. Her life spanned the French Revolution, the rise and fall of Napoleon, the Bourbon Restoration, and the July Revolution, some of the most tumultuous decades in European history. Through it all, she maintained a dignity and resilience that earned her the respect of friend and foe alike. Today, visitors to Paris can see memorials to this tragic family. At the Basilica of Saint-Denis, where French royalty was traditionally buried, markers commemorate Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Louis XVII, and Marie-Thérèse, though her body remains in Slovenia. The Chapelle Expiatoire stands on the site where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were initially buried after their executions, a solemn monument to their memory. The temple prison where the children were held no longer exists. It was demolished by Napoleon in 1808 to erase this painful symbol of the revolution. On its site now stands the Square du Temple, a peaceful garden in the Marais district of Paris. And at Versailles itself, the royal apartments have been preserved, allowing visitors to walk through the same rooms where Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles played as children before their world fell apart. The Petit Trianon, Marie Antoinette's private retreat, where she sought to give her children some semblance of a normal life, can also be toured, its pastoral charm a stark contrast to the formal grandeur of the main palace. These physical spaces help us connect with the human reality behind the historical facts. They remind us that beneath the politics and power struggles of the French Revolution were real people, including children, whose lives were upended and destroyed by forces they could not control. The story of Marie Antoinette's children is not just a tale of royal tragedy, it's a reminder of the vulnerability of children in times of conflict. It prompts us to consider how often, throughout history and even today, children become the collateral damage of adult battles for power and ideology. Perhaps that's why their story continues to resonate more than 2 centuries later. In their faces, preserved in portraits that still hang in museums around the world, we see not the symbols of monarchy that revolutionaries sought to destroy, but simply children, innocent, vulnerable, and worthy of protection regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Your breathing is slowing now, finding a gentle rhythm as you sink deeper into comfort. The weight of your body feels pleasantly heavy against your mattress. You notice your shoulders relaxing, dropping away from your ears as tension melts. That's it, just like that. As your muscles release, your mind drifts with the story, watching history unfold through the eyes of these royal children whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. The legacy of Marie Antoinette's children extends far beyond their brief lives. Their story has been told and retold through the centuries, inspiring books, films, plays, and endless speculation. What might have been? How would history have unfolded if the revolution had never happened? If Louis Charles had grown up to become King Louis XVI? If Marie-Thérèse had married and had children of her own? These questions have no answers, only the shadowy possibilities of alternate histories that never came to be. What we do know is how their actual lives unfolded, the privileged beginning, the terrifying middle, and for 3 of the 4 children, the tragically early end. In the decades after Marie-Thérèse's death, France continued its political evolution. The monarchy established by Louis-Philippe after the 1830 revolution lasted until 1848, when yet another revolution established the Second Republic. This gave way to the Second Empire under Napoleon III, which in turn fell after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. Through all these changes, the memory of the royal children persisted, becoming part of the complex mythology of the French Revolution. For royalists, they were martyrs, innocent victims of revolutionary excess. For republicans, they were unfortunate casualties in the necessary struggle for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between these polarized views. The children themselves were neither symbols nor political pawns, but simply human beings caught in the crossfire of history. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of their story is how ordinary many of their experiences were, despite their extraordinary circumstances. Louis Joseph's childhood illness and death, tragic as it was all too common in an era before modern medicine, when many parents lost children to disease. Little Sophie's premature birth and brief life similarly reflected the high infant mortality of the time. Even Marie-Thérèse's longevity was marked by the ordinary human experiences of grief, adaptation, and resilience. After surviving unimaginable trauma, she built a life for herself, finding purpose in preserving her family's memory and supporting causes she believed in. In her later years, she became known for her charitable works, particularly her support for orphanages, a touching echo of her own lost childhood. Only Louis Charles's fate stands out as extraordinary in its cruelty. The deliberate abuse of a child for political purposes crosses a line that most societies, even in times of violent revolution, recognize as unacceptable. His treatment in the Temple prison represents a dark chapter, not just in French history, but in the broader history of humanity's capacity for cruelty. The mystery surrounding Louis Charles's death and the persistent claims of survivors speak to something deep in human nature: our reluctance to accept the deaths of children, our desire to believe in miraculous escapes, our need for stories with happier endings than history often provides. One of the most fascinating aspects of this story is how it continues to evolve even centuries later. The 2000 DNA testing that confirmed Louis Charles's death brought modern science to bear on a historical mystery, giving us certainty where previous generations had only speculation. The final interment of his heart in 2004 provided a ritual closure that had been denied for over 200 years. These modern epilogues remind us that history is never truly finished. New technologies, new methodologies, and new perspectives constantly reshape our understanding of the past. The story of Marie Antoinette's children continues to be written even as we speak. What lessons can we draw from their lives? Perhaps the most obvious is about the vulnerability of children in times of political conflict. When ideologies clash and societies fracture, children often bear the consequences of decisions made by adults. This was true in revolutionary France, and it remains true around the world today. Another lesson might be about the resilience of the human spirit. Marie-Thérèse's ability to rebuild her life after such profound trauma speaks to the capacity for survival that lies within each of us. Though permanently marked by her experiences, she found ways to move forward, to contribute, to maintain her dignity in the face of repeated loss and exile. There's also something to be said about the way political narratives shape our understanding of history. The story of Marie Antoinette and her children has been told differently depending on who was doing the telling: royalists or republicans, contemporaries or historians, French or foreign observers. These varying perspectives remind us to approach historical narratives with a critical eye, aware of the biases and agendas that inform them. For those of us living in more stable times and places, their story might prompt gratitude for the relative peace and security we enjoy. Most of us will never experience the extreme upheavals that defined the lives of Marie-Thérèse and Louis Charles. The simple freedom to live without fear of political persecution or revolutionary violence is a privilege that many throughout history, including these royal children, were denied. As you lie there, warm and safe in your bed, take a moment to appreciate that safety. Feel the weight of your blanket, the softness of your pillow, the quiet of your room. These simple comforts were precisely what Marie Antoinette's children lost when revolution came to Versailles. Your breathing deepens now, in and out, slow and steady. The story of these royal children begins to blur at the edges as your mind grows pleasantly heavy. You might wonder, as you drift towards sleep, what became of the royal dynasty after Marie-Thérèse's death. The Bourbon claim to the French throne passed to the Count of Chambord, grandson of Charles V, whom Marie-Thérèse had helped raise. He never ruled, though he came close during the political chaos following the Franco-Prussian War. When he died childless in 1883, the senior Bourbon claim passed to the Spanish branch of the family. But these are just echoes now, growing fainter as the centuries pass. France has been a republic since 1870, with only a brief interruption during the Nazi occupation. The monarchy that shaped the lives of Marie Antoinette's children exists now only in museums, history books, and the magnificent palace at Versailles, which receives millions of visitors each year. Those visitors walk through the same rooms where Marie-Thérèse practiced her music, where Louis Joseph studied his lessons despite his frail health, where little Louis Charles played with his toy soldiers, blissfully unaware of the fate that awaited him. They stroll through the gardens where Marie Antoinette took her children to escape the stifling etiquette of court life. They visit the Petit Trianon, where the royal family sought moments of normalcy away from public scrutiny. In these spaces, across the centuries, we can almost glimpse the human reality behind the historical facts. A mother who loved her children, children who laughed and played and learned, a family whose private bonds were tested and ultimately broken by public events. Your eyelids are growing heavier now, your thoughts drifting and merging like clouds on a lazy summer day. The weight of history grows lighter as sleep approaches, the story of Marie Antoinette's children settling gently into your mind. Perhaps you'll dream of Versailles tonight, its mirrored halls and formal gardens, its fountains sparkling in the sunlight. Perhaps you'll catch a glimpse of Marie-Thérèse walking with her brother Louis Joseph, or little Louis Charles chasing butterflies across a manicured lawn, or baby Sophie in her ornate cradle, all of them untouched by the tragedy that awaited. Or perhaps you'll dream of something else entirely, your subconscious weaving its own tales as you rest. Either way, the story will be there waiting for you when you wake, this small but significant chapter in the grand narrative of human history. Your breathing has found its rhythm now, deep and regular. Each breath carries you further from wakefulness, closer to the peaceful realm of sleep. Your body feels wonderfully heavy, sinking into your mattress as if it were embracing you. The tension in your muscles has melted away, from your forehead to your jaw, from your shoulders to your hands, from your hips to your feet. Every part of you is relaxed, supported, safe. Behind your closed eyelids, images may still flicker. The golden splendor of Versailles, the dark stones of the temple prison, the face of Marie-Thérèse as she emerged from captivity, forever changed by what she had endured. But these images grow fainter, less distinct as sleep draws nearer. The sounds around you fade into the background, perhaps the distant hum of traffic, the gentle whir of a fan, the subtle creaks of your home settling for the night. These ordinary noises bear no resemblance to what Marie Antoinette's children heard, the formal music of court, balls, the angry shouts of revolutionaries, the heavy tread of guards outside a prison cell. Your world is peaceful, secure in ways theirs never was. Even the scents around you, the clean smell of laundered sheets, perhaps a hint of whatever you had for dinner, the familiar scent of your bedroom, are comfort-filled reminders of home, so different from the mingled aromas of Versailles with its perfumes and unwashed bodies, or the dank mustiness of a medieval prison. Your mind drifts now from these sensory experiences, floating freely as sleep approaches. The story of Marie Antoinette's children recedes, becoming just one of countless tales stored in your memory, to be recalled another day if you wish. In this drowsy, in-between state, you might find yourself wondering about other historical children whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. The young princes in the Tower of London, the children of Nicholas and Alexandra in revolutionary Russia, the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun in ancient Egypt. History is filled with such stories, each unique yet sharing common threads of vulnerability and consequence. But these thoughts too grow distant and hazy as sleep wraps around you like a warm cocoon. Your consciousness is floating now, untethered, drifting between history and dreams, between the stories of others and the story that is uniquely yours. Your breathing is so slow and deep now, your body completely at rest. The weight of your eyelids is too much to resist, and you surrender to it willingly, gladly. The world outside falls away. The concerns of the day, the to-do lists for tomorrow, even the historical tale you've been following, all recede into the background. In this moment there is only the comfort of your bed, the rhythm of your breath, and the approaching tide of sleep. You welcome it, allowing each wave to carry you further from shore, out into the peaceful ocean of rest. Sleep comes now, gentle and inevitable, carrying you into its depths. Your mind quiets, your thoughts slow and then still. Your awareness of the outside world fades completely. And as you drift into the deepest realms of sleep, perhaps somewhere in that mysterious landscape, you'll catch a glimpse of 4 children playing in the gardens of Versailles, untouched by revolution, unaware of history, simply being children in the sunshine of an endless summer day. Sleep well, sleep deep, sleep in peace, secure in your bed in a way Marie Antoinette's children never could be, grateful for the simple blessing of safety that they were denied. Rest now, and when you wake, carry with you a small remembrance of their story, not to sadden you, but to remind you of the preciousness of ordinary peace, of family bonds, of childhood itself. Good night.